Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. I'm really pleased to say that I've got Richard Hanks on the line with me today. Richard is an in-house recruiter at MRA. I'll let him tell you a bit more about his background, and what we're going to do after that is talk about some of the common myths about moving in-house and some of the sort of misunderstandings, I guess, that lawyers I speak to have with regard to an in-house career and what they can achieve and what they can't achieve, etc. Richard, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Hasnara. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Yeah, it's a bit miserable outside, but you know, cheerful to be talking to you.
Oh, too kind. Well, thank you for inviting me to do this.
Why don't you tell viewers a little bit more about your background?
Sure.
How did you get into recruitment?
How did I get into recruitment? Well, I, like quite a few people who moved into legal recruitment, was a lawyer originally. So I trained and qualified with Travers Smith and qualified into their corporate department where I was in the private equity group. And I loved Travers Smith. I loved the people there, but I didn't really enjoy being a lawyer. So I got to about 2 years qualified and went to see one of the other recruiters, Taylor Root, actually about moving away from doing deals and being a PSL. And within about 30 seconds of talking to Taylor Root about being a PSL, that quickly didn't sound like the answer for me. And they said, what about recruitment? And I sort of said, what about recruitment? And they introduced me to a chap called Nick Root, who started Taylor Root, who told me recruitment was the best job in the world. And I ended up staying at Taylor Root for the next 17 years in their in-house team. Wow,
okay. And now you're at MRA, so what do you do there?
So I moved to MRA Search about 2 years ago, really to set up an in-house function for MRA. So MRA is about 11 years old now. And really their focus throughout that time before I joined was the private practice market, initially partners and then the associate side of things. And they'd done a little bit of in-house, but not much. They hadn't had anyone focusing on it. So I came with pretty much a blank sheet of paper and looked to develop a function for them, which has been great fun.
So before I go on to asking you some of the most common questions I get asked during conversations I have with lawyers I support through my outplacement work, I thought it would be quite helpful for you to give viewers a quick overview of what's going on in the jobs market, but more specifically for in-house jobs, especially in light of COVID and a potential second lockdown, etc.
Yeah, no, sure. Well, look, if I get back to the beginning of the year, January and February, January certainly tends to be a slow start for the in-house market. You tend to see things sort of get going towards the end of January, but it was a good start, and we were pretty busy as we went into March. The moment that at the end of March we went into lockdown, I would say that almost without exception, every job we had on went on hold, either immediately or within the space of the next 2 or 3 weeks. And it stayed like that through much of April and May. But then a lot of those things that had gone on hold came back off hold, became active again. I guess things went on hold for a variety of reasons. Some went on hold because clients were concerned about, where this was taking us and what uncertainties that threw up. But actually also quite a lot of people were just not particularly comfortable with the idea of conducting an interview process virtually, certainly not particularly comfortable with the idea of someone starting remotely. And I guess, like a lot of us, they thought, let's leave it for 2 or 3 months until we can pick things up as they were before. And obviously, what's happened is that this is not gone away in any meaningful sense. And obviously, recently looks like it's coming back again. So I think a lot of those clients got over that initial reticence, got used to the idea of conducting a virtual interview process in its entirety and having people starting remotely. And that certainly helped to sort of kickstart the recruitment market. And, we've had I wouldn't overstate it, but we've had a steady trickle of new roles coming in over the last 3 or 4 months. So it's definitely gone in the right direction, but it was, pretty dire in the early part of spring.
Well, it's good to hear that there's been a bit of an uptick. And are you noticing vacancies in particular sectors, or is it across the board, or are you seeing some that are suffering more?
I think that rather than sectors, I would perhaps attach particular skill sets.
Okay.
The most notable thing I would say is the demand for technology lawyers that we're seeing across all sectors, whether financial services or heavy industry. Every technology is one of those ubiquitous skill sets that is an adjunct to the commercial lawyer, commercial contracts lawyer. But if I had to pick one area that's most in demand, I would say that is it.
Okay. And what would you say are big no-nos for people who want to specialise or at some point move in-house? What areas should they not be qualifying into? Because
in terms of what they're thinking about.
Yeah, so let's deal with the very junior end of the market first, and we'll move further up the food chain. So let's offer some support to final seat trainees who are coming up for qualification. I guess the two questions I get asked the most with regard to final seat trainees is, number one, if I move in-house as an NQ, is that a bad idea or a good idea? The pushbacks I hear are things like lack of support, lack of training. And then the second one is, if I want to go in-house at some point in my career, are there practice areas that would be better for me to qualify into?
Yeah.
So do you want to start with the moving in-house as an NQ first?
Sure. Okay. I think that concern about whether or not that is a good or a bad thing to do, there are some good reasons to be concerned about that. And sometimes we'll hear clients being a little reticent looking at someone's CV when they are 3, 4, 5 years qualified who has moved in-house at a newly qualified stage and might prefer someone who has spent a year or two in a law firm. I guess for candidates, they need to understand that in all likelihood, there will be far less, if any, formalized training in-house. I think a lot of the training that in-house lawyers will receive is either classic sort of on the job, doing the job type of training, or it is, for example, attending external seminars, most often run by their panel law firms, where they are, getting a little bit of that sort of academic sort of training. But they won't have the formalized structures that, particularly in the larger law firms, they would have become used to. Most of the time, however, if they're moving into even a relatively small team, they're likely to be not the only lawyer, and therefore surrounded by at least one or two, if not more senior lawyers who will be there to provide guidance.
And I think that's the point, isn't it, in that ultimately the level of support you get, or the level of responsibility you get, and the amount of training you get will ultimately depend on the size of the legal team that you're joining and the structure of the legal team, because some in-house legal departments are frankly bigger than small law firms, and then you've got others where you could be potentially one of two. So that's worth, I think, candidates certainly considering. And then what about practice areas? The one I hear that's challenging is arbitration and litigation.
Yes. Well, I would probably distinguish between the two of those. I'm actually working on an in-house arbitration role at the moment, which is the first in-house arbitration role I've worked on in 20 years in legal recruitment.
And the first one I've ever come across, because I get asked that question so often, and they're like gold dust. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I think partly, historically, my focus has been the financial services market. And I think particularly in that market, arbitration is, at least not in years gone by, an area that's been at all prevalent. I think it's becoming a little more prevalent now. But I think you're right. Fundamentally, you rarely see in-house arbitration roles. Litigation actually has grown over the years. It used to be the
Okay.
case that it was really difficult for litigators to move in-house. It's still pretty difficult as a general commercial litigator to move in-house. You don't tend to see your average large corporate hiring a commercial litigator to handle their litigation, because I guess that they expect their litigation to be relatively exceptional, and when it happens, they will need a lot of external support. But there are some more specialist areas of litigation, most obviously banking litigation, that's grown enormously over the last 10 years. And allied to that, contentious regulatory work, regulatory investigations work, has also ballooned in the financial services sector generally. So, those areas of contentious practice, there is demand for in-house. It's still not as widespread as for more general non-contentious areas, but it's not non-existent as it might have been.
And what about on the transactional side?
Well, I'd say, yeah, the core areas that you're going to see most demand in terms of departments to qualify into are corporate or commercial. Commercial probably number one, without a doubt. And I guess that's because commercial lawyers, commercial contracts lawyers, I touched on technology earlier.
Yeah.
They are in ubiquitous demand across all industry sectors, whereas there are some other skill sets that you would expect to find either only appearing in some sectors or predominantly in some sectors. And areas like banking and derivatives, it stands to reason that you're only going to see those typically coming up in the banking market or other areas of financial services.
And would you say that it's reasonable that to assume that when in-house legal teams are looking to recruit, they consider not just the practice area the candidate is qualified into or specialises in, but also potential exposure to sectors? Because I noticed that some in-house jobs are advertised but by practice area, but others are more general sort of legal counsel, and the emphasis seems to be placed more on industry insight and knowledge rather than being pinned to one particular practice area.
Yes.
Is it more of a case-by-case basis?
I think if I'm going to generalize about it, it is more of a seniority point.
Okay.
I think at a junior to mid-level, in the main, sector experience is probably a nice to have rather than an essential, and more important is what sort of skill set you're bringing. I think the more senior you get, the more experience of that industry sector becomes increasingly important, particularly, for example, if it's a regulated sector and the client is understandably looking for someone who has experience of operating within a regulated environment. And it's one of the reasons why there's sometimes a degree of frustration from senior candidates that they are not getting a look in for roles that are in sectors that are different to the ones they've had experience in, because that experience is sought. And lots of senior candidates will feel that their experience is transferable across lots of industry sectors, and some clients will be ambivalent about it, but lots of clients won't be ambivalent about it.
Okay, since you've mentioned the seniority point, let's go on to my next frequently asked question, which is, what's the ideal PQE at which you should move in-house? Because there's that chicken and egg situation, isn't there, where if you leave it too late, you might not have the sector experience that you've just mentioned. You become more sort of pigeonholed in terms of practice area. Whereas as a junior lawyer, you could arguably be a bit more versatile and they can mould you what they need. But then there's the fear of the lack of training, which we've also covered. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, there isn't a black and white answer to this one. I mean, I
Why
guess...
did I think you'd say that? Because it's never black and white, is it, when it comes to looking for a job?
No. Well, it's the law. I think that you will see most jobs coming up for lawyers at a certain level, and that level is probably 2 to 5 years qualified, 2 to 6 years qualified, and both below that and above that, the job numbers in terms of volume tail off a little bit. So in terms of the plentifulness of choice for you as a candidate, those are probably the years to be thinking about. But we see plenty of examples of jobs coming up at the newly qualified level increasingly, and equally, we will see clients coming to us saying they're looking for someone with 8 years experience or 10 years experience, and perfectly happy to entertain candidates coming out of private practice. So, you shouldn't feel that below 2 or 3 years qualified that you can't do it, because you can if you want to. And equally, you shouldn't necessarily feel you've left it too late. It's some of the cliches you might have heard in the past are, if you've left it to your 7 or 8 years qualified, you're only doing it because you can't get partnership and everyone's just going to assume you're being ejected from your law firm. I just don't think that is the case now. At a newly qualified or 1 year qualified level, going back to the point we talked about before about is it a good idea to move in-house at that level? I think that provided that the client feels you have enough experience, it's really down to you as an individual as to whether you feel you have enough confidence to make the move. Because moving in-house, you do move away from the support and the infrastructure and just the comfort, if you like, of being in a law firm environment. When you work in-house, you are more exposed. Teams are leanly staffed. You don't have that infrastructure. You don't have typically, an enormous bank of precedents. You don't have PSL lawyers and know-how lawyers, and you need to be proactive and do a lot more yourself. And you may not have a PA. You probably have to do a lot of your typing yourself and your filing and all of those things. You need to be used to all of that. And from a legal perspective, you need to be used to the fact that internally, clients are going to, stakeholders are going to see you as the lawyer, and they won't see you as the newly qualified lawyer or the 1 year qualified lawyer or the 5 year qualified lawyer. They'll see you as the lawyer. This is a legal issue. What are we going to do about it? Okay. And that requires a certain level of self-confidence. And, some 1 year qualifieds will have that in abundance. Some 5 year qualifieds won't have that, and they'll want to wait until they're 7 or 8 years qualified. So I think a certain amount of it is down to you as an individual.
Okay. And we've talked about sort of PQE level to move in-house. I'm going to come on to skills in a moment, because I think that's really important. What about secondments? How important is a client secondment on one CV if they're looking to move in-house? Is it a deal breaker?
No, I wouldn't go as far as saying it's a deal breaker. It's undoubtedly helpful in all circumstances, I think. And the main reason it's helpful, well, there's two reasons probably. One, I think from a client perspective, it de-risks their hiring decision to a certain extent, in the sense that if someone who's got first-hand experience of working in-house, because it is very different to working in private practice, the clients at least have some comfort that that the person who is making that decision to make a move into the in-house environment has a sense of what it might be like, and that they will enjoy it, and it's something they want to do. And the other reasons why it's helpful is that I would say invariably a key part of an interview process will be explaining your decision, why you want to move in-house, as well as why you're interested in that organisation and that job. Clients want to understand what your motivations are and why you want to move in-house. And it obviously lends credibility to your answers to that question if you know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Having said all of that, we've placed plenty of lawyers over the years who don't have in-house secondment experience. You can't, in most cases, engineer an in-house secondment. And particularly, I think, in US law firms, it's quite difficult to engineer in-house secondments. So I think there are plenty of clients who will still be perfectly happy to hire clearly bright, talented, capable lawyers who don't have the in-house secondment experience. I think there are some industry sectors where it might be more important than others, particularly commerce over financial services. Yeah. So it's definitely helpful, but not a deal breaker.
Okay, so that's useful to know. What about skills? You've touched upon that in the past, because I know, having previously worked as a private practice recruiter, specializing in corporate and more specifically private equity, it was all about the deals. That's what the partners are looking out for. What would you say are the sort of key skills that in-house legal teams are looking for when considering candidates? Pick two or three that candidates should try to at least highlight in their CVs.
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by skills. I mean, I guess, we're still very much in a market where lots of clients will be quite specific about the type of experience they're looking for, depending on what the job is. And that comes down to obviously your area of practice. I think in terms of, the key skill set, I suppose, is being able to translate your legal knowledge and experience into a practical and commercial context. Without exception, every client we hire for says they want their lawyers to be commercial, and not as in commercial contracts lawyers, but to be able to take a commercial view about things. And you can get, again, all the sort of hackneyed cliches come out about.
What does that look like though in a CV? Because anyone can just say, yes, I'm very commercial, and I get what you mean about not drafting a supplier agreement or an outsourcing agreement. This is commercial, about understanding what's associated with a particular decision, etc., or whether and not just regurgitating what the law is. How does one demonstrate that in a CV?
I think it's difficult to demonstrate it in a CV, and I don't think a client would necessarily, an in-house employer would necessarily be looking for someone to demonstrate it in their CV. Okay. They'll be looking for them to demonstrate it through the interview process, and I think that's partly about simply how you present yourself in interview, and it's partly about demonstrating what you would do in particular situations. It's the sort of competency side of interviewing that you're frequently asked about in in-house interviews. Sometimes you're thrown a particular example of an actual situation that client has been dealing with recently.
I agree. I think that on a CV, it's really difficult to showcase that, which is why I've seen recently a couple of in-house teams have actually asked the candidate to complete a supplementary form asking to describe a scenario where they had to, the most challenging experience they've had as working as a lawyer in private practice, i.e. what's the most challenging commercial decision you've had to make. Okay, let's move on to let's assume that you've now moved in-house. A couple of things, if you can sort of give me some quick sort of answers. I appreciate that these are all complex. Number one, okay, let's assume that someone has taken the plunge, moved in-house, and then they regret their decision and think, actually, the grass isn't greener. How often do you see people moving backwards and forwards between private practice and in-house?
You used to see it never, or almost never.
My thoughts, okay.
You see it a bit more now for differing reasons. I think fundamentally, the vast majority of people who move in-house do it for particular reasons and don't want to return. It is a one-way trip for them. I think where we've seen an exception to that more recently is in two places. One is for people who might have, going back to one of our earlier questions, might have moved in-house as a newly qualified or at a very early stage of their career, and might, as a 3, 4, 5 year qualified, feel I might benefit from going back into the formal environment of a law firm. Arguably, many of them with a view that in the longer term they'll return in-house, but perhaps they moved in-house too soon, and they might benefit from going back into a law firm for 2 or 3 years. At the other end of the spectrum, I think partly driven by a dearth of senior level in-house opportunities, we've seen senior in-house lawyers go back into private practice as partners quite successfully. And I can think of a few examples of people I know and have worked with over the years who have done that, whose names I won't drop, but done it very, very successfully.
Just on that point, just moving
yes.
on, the dearth of senior in-house legal jobs. What does a typical sort of career roadmap look like for someone who's decided to flip to the other side and go in-house? What does career progression look like for an individual who's made that switch?
Because Nari, you keep asking questions that don't have black and white answers to them.
I'm a journalist, I can't help myself.
It's tricky. The career path is tricky because it's much more opaque than in private practice. You know,
I guess that's what I was hinting at, because in
yes.
a law firm, it's quite straight line, isn't it?
It is.
Most firms still operate some sort of lockstep model. With
yeah.
in-house, I'm assuming that it can be a bit more zigzagging and opaque, as you've said.
It can be. I mean, it's pretty straightforward what you're aiming for. You know, the senior position is general counsel. Sometimes it has another name, and perhaps we can touch on titles as well, because I think that's a relevant point. But you're aiming for general counsel, and you probably start as legal counsel or something similar to that. But there is no set career path to make your way from, you know, one to the other. The career progression is a difficult subject in-house, because most in-house teams are relatively flat structures. And even if you're part of a very large legal department in a large corporate, that will tend to be made up of smaller individual sub-teams with people of varying levels of qualification who all report into one head of that team. And unless the head of that team moves on or disappears for whatever reason, there's no obvious place to go. And so it's probably one of, if not the main reason why in-house candidates get in touch with us, because they want to move in order to gain a more senior position, because they don't feel that's possible where they are.
Okay.
So my point about titles, I suppose there are all sorts of different titles that are used within the in-house legal market. Legal counsel, senior legal counsel, principal legal counsel, head of legal, deputy head of legal, assistant general counsel, associate general counsel, you know, and a never-ending list. And none of them, with the probable exception of general counsel, have a universal meaning. It just depends what it means in that particular organization. So I'm very reticent about attaching too much importance to a title. However, for you as the lawyer and the recipient of that title, I completely understand why you might feel differently to that. But it can be a distraction, I'd say, from what the substance of the job is. What we as recruiters look at when we're looking at someone's CV is the substance of their experience, the level of their responsibility, the level of responsibility of the person they report to, what their geographic responsibilities might be, whether they have people management responsibilities. You know, all of those substantive things are much more important to us than what your title is. So I think, and those elements that I've talked about, I suppose, are the elements that people will try and gain and expand as they progress their career towards being a general counsel. Okay.
Just before we wrap up, one final question, if I may, which is, if you had to highlight 3 key points for a lawyer to consider who is potentially thinking about making their first move in-house, what would that be?
Do you mean 3 points in terms of how it might differ from what they're used to in?
No, just sort of things that they should be aware of that perhaps they don't necessarily think about, you know, in terms of common myths that we're trying to dispel, or incorrect assumptions that they make about what the process involves.
Okay. Well, number one in terms of common myths, and I can't believe I'm even going to say this because it seems such a historic common myth, but, you know, there has in the past been a myth that the in-house market is where you go if you can't make it in private practice. That is obviously not the case, and there are so many highly talented, capable lawyers who would have and have been very successful in private practice who operate in-house. So that is not the case. So I think the second thing I'd say is that people who are successful in-house are able to move out of their specialism and operate as generalists in many cases. And I am generalizing, because of course you do still get specialists in-house, but as far as your internal stakeholders are concerned, I touched on this earlier, this is a legal issue, you're the lawyer, how are you going to help me solve this? I don't, they have no interest in whether you're an IP lawyer or an employment lawyer. You're the lawyer, and we need you to adapt your skill set to operate in this type of environment. So I think that to be successful, you need to be someone who can embrace that and who can use your core legal skills, your training, your background, your legal common sense, your judgment, your risk antenna, and adapt that to situations that you're not familiar with. The last point I'd say is that not everyone can get to the top. I think the law firm environment is quite an unusual environment in some ways, with the number of partners that can operate within a law firm. So you are able to progress your career to a certain extent independent of those around you. And there's an opportunity, in theory, for every private practice lawyer to make partner. Agreed. There is not an opportunity for every in-house lawyer.
You have more than one partner in the same team, but Absolutely. You can't necessarily have two general counsel.
You can't. So I think you have to recognize that there are different ways in which to progress your career as an in-house lawyer that don't necessarily end in you getting to general counsel. And I think that is an adjustment of mindset that is particular to the legal market.
Agreed. I'm glad you flagged that, because I really do think that a lot of people, especially when you're thinking of making the move at the slightly more senior end, they don't have a clear vision of what the end game is, or they have a very rigid vision with no flexibility built in, not fully appreciating that there is often a pyramid that exists within an in-house legal team.
I think that's right. And as a senior lawyer, we often talk to partners who might be at that stage of their career considering an in-house move, and their in many cases default assumption is that they will go in as a head of legal or general counsel, and that might be the case. Quite frequently it isn't the case, partly because there aren't enough of those jobs around just for that to materialize, but partly because it's just not a slam dunk that as a successful partner you can slot straight into a general counsel role. There might be skills and attributes that you need to develop within the in-house market that could take you there. Yeah. So yes, I think that is the case.
Brilliant. Okay, well, Richard, all really, really interesting stuff. Thank you very much for
my pleasure.
That insight, and apologies for questions that don't have black and white answers, but that's what makes our work interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Shazara.
Good to chat with you. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.